There is a version of World War I that most people carry somewhere in the back of their minds. It involves mud and poetry, heroic charges and tragic waste, young men who believed in something and died before they could be proven wrong. It is the version with the poppy fields and the silence of Armistice Day, the version where suffering, however enormous, was eventually acknowledged, honored, folded into ceremony. That version exists because it is easier to live with than the truth. The truth is quieter and far more disturbing. It does not involve extraordinary evil or monstrous decisions made by cartoonish villains. It involves something much harder to process, which is the absolute normalization of conditions that, under any other circumstances, any reasonable human being would recognize as catastrophic. The truth of World War I is not that it was tragic, it is that it became routine. By the time the war reached its third year, men were being processed through systems so large and so impersonal that the individual human body had become, in administrative terms, a consumable unit. Not metaphorically, literally. There were forms for this. There were supply chains organized around it. There were officers whose entire job was to calculate how many men could be expected to survive a given operation, not so that the operation could be made safer, but so that replacement numbers could be ordered in advance. This is where the story actually begins. Not in the trenches, not in the mud, in the paperwork, in the quiet offices behind the front lines where men with clean uniforms moved figures around on tables and referred to human beings as wastage. The word wastage appears in actual British military documents from World War I. It was the official term used to describe the rate at which soldiers were being killed, wounded, or rendered permanently incapable of service. Wastage was calculated weekly. It was projected forward. Commanding officers were given wastage estimates before operations, which meant that before a single shell was fired, someone had already written down an acceptable number of men to lose. The soldiers who would become that number had not yet died. They were alive somewhere, sleeping or eating or writing letters home. But they had already been accounted for as a projected loss. This is the first thing to understand about what World War I actually was. It was a system, a very large, very organized, very modern system, and within that system, the death of a human being was a data point. Soldiers who survived long enough to understand how the system worked often described a specific moment of realization. It came differently for different men. For some, it came when they watched a friend die and an officer nearby wrote something in a notebook without pausing. For others, it came when they were briefed before an assault, and the briefing included casualty projections delivered in the same tone one might use to discuss weather conditions. For many, it came simply from the accumulating weight of time, the slow understanding that no one above them in the chain of command was particularly distressed by the numbers, because the numbers were expected, the numbers were planned for, the numbers were, in every functional sense of the word, normal. What follows is an account of 22 things that soldiers in World War I experienced, witnessed or adapted to that would, under any other framework, be considered extraordinary evidence of civilizational breakdown. Instead, they became ordinary. They became the texture of daily life for millions of men across years of continuous, industrialized warfare. They are presented here not as curiosities or horrors to be consumed, but as evidence of what happens when modern bureaucratic states apply the full force of industrial organization to the problem of killing each other, and when the human beings caught inside that system adapt well enough to keep functioning. The first of these things is the smell. This sounds simple. It is not simple. The smell of the Western Front was so specific, so persistent, and so unlike anything that had existed in human experience before industrialized trench warfare, that veterans who survived the war would report encountering fragments of it decades later and being immediately transported back. Not metaphorically transported, physiologically transported, the body responding to a sensory trigger before the conscious mind could intervene. The smell was composed of several distinct elements that combined into something with no analog in peacetime life. There was the smell of wet earth and clay, which was constant. There was the smell of cordite and explosive residue, which settled into clothing and skin and hair. There was the smell of unwashed bodies packed into enclosed spaces for weeks at a time. There was the smell of latrines, which in many sections of the front were nothing more than open pits cut into the floor of the trench, sometimes overflowing when heavy rains raised the water table. And underneath all of this, present in varying intensities depending on location and season and how recently there had been fighting, there was the smell of decomposition. The dead were everywhere. This is the second thing. Not in the abstract, rhetorical way that phrase is sometimes used to convey the scale of a war. Literally everywhere. In the ground beneath the trenches, because trenches were dug into earth that had already been used as a battlefield and already contained the remains of men killed in earlier engagements. In the walls of the trenches, because the boards and sandbags that lined trench walls were sometimes packed against earth that contained human remains, and when the walls shifted or partially collapsed, what was inside them became visible. In no man's land, the contested strip of ground between the opposing trench systems, where men killed during raids or assaults, often could not be retrieved, because retrieving them required exposing living soldiers to the same fire that had killed the dead ones. Bodies left in no man's land decomposed in place. In summer, this process was rapid and visible. In winter, bodies froze and were preserved in positions of death for weeks or months, only to thaw and resume decomposition when the temperature rose again. Soldiers learned to navigate around the dead. They learned which sections of their trench had intact bodies beneath the flooring, and which sections had bones, and which sections were more recently occupied by the newly killed. They learned to recognize the specific topography of no man's land in their sector, which included the shapes of unrecovered corpses that had been there long enough to become landmarks. There were accounts of soldiers using specific bodies as navigation references during night raids, noting that you turned left at a particular mound that had once been a man and had been there since the previous autumn. This was not callousness in the conventional sense. It was adaptation. It was the mind and the body adjusting to conditions in the only way that allowed continued function. The third thing is rats. The rats of the Western Front are mentioned in almost every first-hand account of trench life, and yet the reality of what soldiers described has been so thoroughly domesticated by repetition that the actual content of their descriptions rarely registers. The rats were large. Soldiers consistently described them as being the size of cats, and while this description has sometimes been attributed to the distortions of traumatic memory, there is a straightforward biological explanation for why it was accurate. The rats had access to an essentially unlimited food supply. They fed on the dead. They fed on the stored rations of the living. They fed on anything organic that entered the trench environment, and they bred with the speed and efficiency that unlimited food enables. What grew up in the trenches was not the ordinary rat population of European fields and hedgerows. It was a rat population that had been specifically selected across multiple generations for size and aggression and tolerance of human presence. Veterans described rats running across their faces while they slept. They described waking to find rats sitting on their chests. They described the sounds of rats moving through the dark, which were loud enough and constant enough that new arrivals often confused them with the sounds of enemy movement. They described the specific sensation of a rat bite, which the larger animals delivered without the hesitancy of smaller, wilder rodents. The rats of the Western Front had lost their fear of humans. They had lived in close proximity to human remains long enough that a living human being was simply another large, warm object in the environment, worth investigating and occasionally worth biting. Soldiers killed rats when they could. They organized rat-killing competitions in quiet moments between bombardments. They developed a dark pride in kill counts. They also learned to sleep through the sound of rats moving around them, and many reported that after enough time, they stopped noticing the rats at all. The fourth thing is the lice. Nearly every man who spent more than a few days in a frontline trench became infested with body lice. This is not an exaggeration, and it is not a figure of speech. The conditions of trench life, the inability to bathe, the sharing of clothing and sleeping spaces, the warmth of packed bodies in enclosed underground areas created ideal breeding conditions for Pediculus humanus corporis, the body louse, And within weeks of arriving at the front, the vast majority of soldiers were hosting populations of them in their clothing, their sleeping bags, their hair. Lice laid their eggs in the seams of clothing. They fed on blood. They produced a constant, maddening itch that was unrelenting and that no amount of scratching could fully relieve because scratching addressed the surface sensation while the lice continued feeding. Soldiers developed routines for managing their lice populations. During rest periods, they would strip off their shirts and run candle flames along the seams, a process they called chatting, which killed the eggs but could not address lice already embedded in hair or living deeper in clothing fabric. They picked lice off each other with a casual intimacy that would have been unthinkable in their previous lives and that they barely registered after enough time had passed. They compared lice populations as a form of small talk. They named their lice, sometimes individually, sometimes collectively. They accepted the itching as a permanent condition of existence, the way a person might accept chronic mild joint pain, something present, constant, and managed rather than cured. The medical consequences were not trivial. Lice were vectors for trench fever, a bacterial disease caused by Bartonella quintana that produced recurring fevers, severe bone pain, and incapacitation for weeks at a time. It is estimated that roughly 5% of all British casualties during the war were attributable to trench fever. The lice that caused it were on nearly every man in every trench, and soldiers scratched and slept and ate and fought through the knowledge that this was simply part of what the war was. The fifth thing is the mud. Mud also sounds simple. The Western Front also sounds like something familiar from the general cultural record of the war. What is almost never conveyed adequately is the specific physical properties of the mud that accumulated in certain sectors, particularly in Flanders, during extended wet periods. The soil of the Ypres salient, where some of the most sustained fighting of the war took place, had specific geological characteristics. It was a fine, dense clay that, when saturated with water, took on a consistency that was less like conventional mud and more like a viscous liquid that could not support the weight of a standing human being. Thousands of soldiers drowned in it, not in rivers, not in flooded dugouts, but in the open ground of the battlefield, in shell craters that had filled with this liquefied clay, in areas where the constant churning of artillery had destroyed all drainage and reduced the landscape to a surface that looked like ground but functioned like quicksand. The standard soldier's equipment, the pack, the ammunition, the rifle, the steel helmet, the gas mask, weighed approximately 60 pounds in dry conditions. When wet, which was the normal condition for most of the war, it weighed more. When a man fell into a shell crater filled with Flanders clay, the weight of his equipment pulled him down, and the properties of the clay made it nearly impossible for other soldiers to pull him out without specialized equipment that was rarely available. Men watched their comrades sink and could not reach them. Men who found themselves alone in craters after being knocked over by blast pressure spent hours or days working their way out of the mud by incremental movements, sometimes requiring the entire length of daylight to cross distances of 30 or 40 feet. The British Third Battle of Ypres, known as Passchendaele, conducted in the autumn of 1917 during an exceptionally wet season, produced conditions that multiple senior officers who visited the front described as beyond anything they had seen or anticipated. The soldiers who fought in it described conditions that had no reference point in any prior human experience. Passchendaele has become a shorthand for futile suffering. What gets lost in that shorthand is the specific, granular reality of what the soldiers there experienced as their daily conditions, which were not futile in the dramatic sense, but simply and persistently awful in a way that language strains to convey. Men stood in water for days. They ate rations that had absorbed water and mud. They slept in positions of partial immersion. They carried out patrols in darkness across ground that might support their weight or might not, and there was no reliable way to tell in advance. They did this not for days, but for weeks and for months, and the ones who did not die or break down psychologically adapted to it. That adaptation is the disturbing part, not the conditions. The adaptation. The sixth thing is the noise. The industrial-scale artillery bombardments that defined the tactical reality of the Western Front produced sound at volumes and with characteristics that had never existed in human experience before this war. The largest artillery pieces used during World War I fired shells that weighed over a ton and traveled distances of more than 20 miles. The sound produced by the simultaneous firing of hundreds of such guns was not merely loud in the way that everyday language understands loudness. It was physically different from ordinary loud sounds. It produced pressure waves that could be felt in the chest cavity and the abdomen. It produced vibrations that passed through the ground into the bodies of men lying or crouching in trenches. During the largest barrages, the continuous sound was loud enough to be heard across the English Channel in southern England by civilians going about their ordinary lives. The Battle of the Somme bombardment was heard in London. For the men directly beneath this sound, the effect on the nervous system was cumulative and eventually structural. The ear has physiological limits beyond which it is damaged by sound pressure. Those limits were routinely exceeded on the Western Front, and many soldiers experienced permanent or long-term hearing loss as a result of their service. But the damage was not only physical. The nervous system, subjected to sustained high-intensity sound over periods of days or weeks, begins to respond in ways that are not under conscious control. Men experienced involuntary trembling, temporary paralysis, loss of speech, inability to process visual information, and complete psychological dissociation under sustained bombardment. And these responses were not the responses of weak or cowardly men. They were the responses of nervous systems that had been pushed past their designed tolerances by an input that nothing in the evolutionary history of the human animal had prepared it for. The military called these responses shell shock, and then later neurasthenia, and then later still various other terms designed to pathologize the response while minimizing the validity of the cause. What the military did not do, for most of the war, was treat it as an injury equivalent to a physical wound. Men who could not function after sustained bombardment were, in many cases, returned to the front after minimal rest. Some were court-martialed for cowardice. Some were executed. The documented execution of soldiers for cowardice or desertion during World War I by the British Army alone numbers over 300 men. Of those, a substantial proportion were, by any reasonable retrospective diagnostic assessment, suffering from severe post-traumatic stress responses. They were shot for their nervous system's failure to tolerate conditions that no nervous system was built to tolerate. The seventh thing is the gas. Chlorine gas was first used as a weapon on the Western Front at the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915. Within months, both sides had developed delivery systems and chemical agents of increasing sophistication. By the time phosgene and mustard gas had entered the arsenal, chemical weapons had become a permanent and expected feature of the battlefield environment, and soldiers had adapted their daily routines to include gas alert procedures with the same reflexive normalcy with which they performed any other routine task. They wore gas masks. They carried gas masks at all times. They slept with gas masks accessible. They practiced donning their gas masks in less than 10 seconds because gas clouds moved faster than 10 seconds allowed, and a delay meant the mask went on in the presence of gas rather than before it. And putting a mask on in the presence of gas meant breathing gas during the few seconds the mask took to seal properly, which was enough to cause injury. The effects of the various chemical agents used during World War I ranged from irritation and temporary incapacitation to excruciating death over periods of hours or days. Mustard gas, which was introduced by Germany in 1917, was particularly effective not because it was immediately lethal, but because it was a persistent agent that settled on surfaces and remained active for hours or days. It caused severe chemical burns to any tissue it contacted: eyes, skin, and the mucous membranes of the respiratory tract. Soldiers blinded by mustard gas were common enough that they were processed through dedicated medical facilities. Soldiers with severe respiratory burns from mustard gas exposure sometimes lived for days before dying. during which time their condition deteriorated in ways that medical staff found difficult to witness, and that the patients found difficult to endure. The word difficult is inadequate. There is no adequate word. What the records show is that soldiers adapted to the reality of gas as a weapon in the same way they adapted to everything else on the Western Front, which is to say they developed routines, and they performed those routines, and they moved on. The moment of putting on a gas mask became reflex. The smell of gas became identifiable and categorizable. Old soldiers could tell younger ones what particular types of gas smelled like and what to do if the smell was present. And in this way, the knowledge of chemical warfare was transmitted between generations of frontline troops as ordinary professional knowledge, the way a carpenter might pass on knowledge of wood grain, or a fisherman might pass on knowledge of tides. The eighth thing is the food. Sustaining millions of men in the field across years of continuous warfare required a logistical operation of unprecedented scale, and the food that arrived at the front as the result of this operation was, by essentially universal testimony, terrible. Not merely unpleasant in the way that institutional food is conventionally unpleasant, actively damaging to health and to morale and to the capacity of the human organism to continue functioning under sustained stress. The basic British Army ration of the war included hardtack biscuits that were so dense and so dry that they required soaking in water or tea before they could be chewed without the risk of breaking teeth. It included tinned bully beef, a canned corned beef product that had a shelf life suited to long-distance supply chains and a flavor suited to nothing else. It included tea, which was frequently the most valued component of the ration, and the one thing that soldiers across virtually all accounts agreed was essential to maintaining something like a functional mental state. Fresh food reached the front in adequate quantities only intermittently. In many sectors, during extended operations or when supply lines were disrupted by bombardment, rations were reduced or stopped entirely, and soldiers subsisted for days on whatever they had managed to cache in their dugouts. Water was scarce and frequently contaminated. The water that reached frontline soldiers often arrived in containers that had previously held petroleum products and tasted accordingly. Soldiers who could not obtain the official water supply drank from whatever sources were available, including puddles and shell craters, sources that contained, in addition to water, whatever else had dissolved in the Flanders mud over the preceding months. Dysentery was common. It was also routine. It was added to the list of conditions that had to be managed rather than resolved. The list that included lice and rats and the smell and the noise and the mud and the gas and everything else that constituted the normal operating environment of a frontline soldier. The ninth thing is the rotation system and what it did to soldiers' understanding of time. The British Army, and most other major armies on the Western Front, operated a system of rotating battalions through frontline duty, rest periods, and reserve positions in a cycle designed to prevent the complete psychological destruction of any given unit while keeping sufficient forces in the line at all times. In theory, this system provided relief. In practice, the rest periods it provided were often spent close enough to the front that they were subject to long-range artillery fire, and often involved labor rather than genuine rest. The digging of reserve trenches, the carrying of supplies forward, the maintenance of infrastructure behind the lines. The rotation system also meant that soldiers spent the war in a specific relationship with time that was unlike any previous military or civilian experience. There was no clear endpoint. This is what the rotation system made viscerally apparent to anyone who thought about it clearly. You went up the line, you came back, you went up the line again. There was no accumulated progress toward a definable conclusion. The same ground was fought over repeatedly. Territory changed hands and changed hands back. Gains measured in hundreds of yards were reported as significant victories. Men who had been at the front for 2 years and then visited what was supposed to be the front line looked at it and recognized the same terrain from their first deployment. The war was not going anywhere. The war simply was. It existed as a permanent condition of the world, and within that permanent condition, the rotation system meant that you periodically returned to it and periodically escaped it, and periodically returned to it again. And this cycle continued until you were dead, or wounded or broken, or the war ended. And for most of the men inside the system, the war ending was not something they could meaningfully imagine. The war had been the context of their lives for so long that life without it had become abstract. The 10th thing is the medical reality of wounds that were survivable in previous wars and became something else in this one. Advances in medical care during World War I were real and significant. Blood transfusion was developed and implemented at scale during this conflict. Antiseptic wound care was increasingly standardized. Mobile surgical units were established closer to the front than had ever been attempted before. The casualty survival rate for men who reached a medical facility improved substantially over the course of the war. This is all true. What is also true is that the wounds being treated were unlike anything that military medicine had previously encountered, because the weapons producing them were unlike anything that had previously been used at this scale. High explosive artillery shells, when they detonated in proximity to a human body, did not produce the clean puncture wounds of rifle fire or even the predictable patterns of older artillery. They produced fragmentation wounds of enormous complexity, with multiple pieces of metal traveling at high velocity through tissue and creating wound channels that were irregular, contaminated with soil and clothing and metal, and frequently impossible to fully explore or clean. The infection rate for World War I wounds was catastrophically high. This was partly a function of wound complexity and partly a function of the specific bacteriological environment of the Western Front, where soil had been repeatedly fertilized with human and animal waste over centuries of agricultural use, and then repeatedly disturbed by artillery, releasing bacterial populations into the air and water that found their way into every open wound. Gas gangrene, caused by Clostridium bacteria thriving in oxygen-poor tissue, was common enough that military surgeons developed specific protocols for it, protocols that involved aggressive debridement, the cutting away of infected tissue, often to extents that would today be considered extraordinary. Surgeons operating close to the front performed amputations under conditions of inadequate anesthesia and inadequate sterility on men who had already been in shock from their wounds for hours. They performed these operations in volumes that would have been considered impossible in peacetime surgical practice. They became efficient at them. The 11th thing is what happened to men who could not continue. The clinical picture of what World War I did to the psychiatric health of its participants was not well understood during the war itself, and has been more fully described in the century since. What was understood during the war, and what the institutional response to that understanding reveals about the nature of the system, is documented in military records that were not primarily intended as psychiatric case studies, but function as them. The British Army alone treated over 80,000 cases of shell shock during the war, a number that represents only those cases that were formally recognized and processed through medical channels. The actual number of men who experienced significant psychological deterioration as a result of their service was certainly much larger, because the majority of such cases were either self-managed by the soldiers, handled informally by their units, or dismissed. The institutional response to shell shock shifted over the course of the war, but never fundamentally resolved the central tension, which was between the medical reality that prolonged exposure to the conditions of the Western Front was producing genuine, serious, and sometimes permanent neurological and psychological damage in a significant proportion of soldiers, and the operational reality that those soldiers were needed in the line. The resolution of this tension was nearly always in favor of the operational requirement. Men were rested, sometimes treated with whatever methods were available, which ranged from electrotherapy to simple periods of removal from the front, and then returned to duty when they were judged capable of performing it. The judgment of capability was not primarily a medical judgment. It was an operational one. A man who could walk and carry a rifle and follow basic orders was, in the operational framework of World War I, a man who could serve. What was happening inside him was a secondary consideration. The 12th thing is the specific experience of going over the top. This phrase has become one of the central images of World War I and has been described so many times in so many contexts that it has acquired a kind of frozen quality, as if it were a scene from a play rather than something that happened to real human bodies in real time. The reality of what soldiers experienced in the minutes before, during, and immediately after climbing out of a trench to advance across open ground toward an enemy position was not frozen. It was intensely physiological. The body's preparation for extreme physical danger, the adrenal response, the acceleration of heart rate, the sharpening of certain sensory channels, and the narrowing of attention produced a state of consciousness that veterans described in terms that converge with considerable consistency. Time moved differently. Pain, when it occurred, was often not registered immediately. The sounds of the battlefield shifted in quality and seemed to organize themselves differently than they did at other times. Men who were struck by fragments and continued moving sometimes did not realize they were wounded until they stopped. The attacks themselves were frequently not the charging rushes of popular imagery. The mud, the wire, the bodies of previously killed men lying in no man's land, and the weight of equipment all conspired to make rapid movement nearly impossible. The standard pace of an infantry advance across heavily shelled ground was a walk, sometimes barely a walk. Men crossed no man's land at a pace that kept them in the field of fire for far longer than any tactical calculation that had been made in a briefing room had anticipated. Machine guns firing at the rates that World War I technology allowed could fire hundreds of rounds per minute. A walking man crossing ground without cover was not a difficult target. The casualty figures from the large set-piece attacks of the war reflect this arithmetic in numbers that are difficult to absorb as human realities. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme, July 1st, 1916, the British Army suffered approximately 60,000 casualties. Roughly 19,000 of those men were killed. It was one day. It was the worst single day in the history of the British Army, and it was followed by another day, and the battle continued for 4.5 months. The 13th thing is what the soldiers did with their dead. In conventional peacetime military funerary practice, the dead are identified, processed, and interred with some degree of ceremony. The scale and pace and physical conditions of World War I made this impossible in most instances and reduced the treatment of the dead to a logistical problem that was solved with whatever solutions were immediately available. Men killed in the front line, if they could be reached, were typically buried in the floor or walls of the trench system, in individual graves if time and conditions permitted, in mass graves when they did not. Men killed in no man's land were often left where they fell, not from indifference, but from the practical reality that retrieving them required exposing living soldiers to the fire that had killed them, and the operational calculus did not support this exchange. Over time, the shelling redistributed and reburied and re-exposed these remains repeatedly, so that the ground of no man's land in sectors that had seen sustained fighting was not simply a place where men had died, but a place whose soil was composed, in substantial part, of their remains. The identification of the dead was a persistent problem throughout the war. Identity discs, the precursors to modern dog tags, were worn by soldiers as an aid to identification, but the physical effects of high-explosive weapons on the human body frequently made identification impossible regardless of whether the discs were present. The formal military category of missing in action, which seems to describe an ambiguous fate that subsequent investigation might resolve, frequently described something more specific and more terrible, which was that there was nothing to find. A substantial proportion of the men listed as missing from World War I were not somewhere unknown. They were present as fragments in the soil of the Western Front, distributed across areas of ground that were fought over so many times that no meaningful burial or identification was possible. The Menin Gate at Ypres, a memorial to the British and Commonwealth soldiers killed in the Ypres salient, whose bodies were never found, carries the names of over 54,000 men. 54,000 names on one gate, and there were not enough gates. The 14th thing is the relationship between soldiers and the officers who commanded them. and what the conditions of the war did to that relationship. The British Army of World War I was organized along class lines that reflected the social structure of Edwardian Britain with considerable precision. Officers were drawn largely from the upper and upper middle classes, educated at public schools, possessing social capital and cultural fluency that marked them as belonging to a distinct social stratum from the men they commanded. The other ranks, the vast majority of the army, were drawn from the working class, from the farms and factories and mines and urban tenements of industrial Britain. These were men from different worlds, brought together by the same war and subject to vastly different conditions within it. Officers ate better. They slept in better conditions. They had access to whiskey where enlisted men had rum. They were saluted. They addressed their men by last names or numbers while being addressed as Sir. When officers were killed, which happened at a significant rate given the requirement for officers to lead from the front, their deaths were processed through the same administrative machinery as the deaths of enlisted men, but they were reported in newspapers by name where enlisted casualties were reported in aggregate. The families of officers received letters of condolence. The families of enlisted men received form letters. These distinctions were maintained as matters of protocol throughout the war, even as the conditions in the trenches themselves were reducing the relevance of social distinction in ways that everyone who experienced them could feel. Men who had crawled through the same mud and survived the same bombardments and carried the same wounds developed a kind of functional equality that the official hierarchy never formally acknowledged and sometimes actively suppressed. The fraternization incident at Christmas 1914, when British and German soldiers in some sectors emerged from their respective trenches and met in no man's land for informal truces, gift exchanges and, in some documented cases, football matches, was not unique in the history of the war, but it became the most famous example of something the High Command on both sides found disturbing for the same reason. It demonstrated that the men doing the fighting did not necessarily share the motivating enmity that the war's continuation required. The Christmas truce was not repeated at the institutional level. Orders were given on both sides, making clear that such fraternization constituted a breach of military discipline and would be treated accordingly. The war, and the organized hatred it required, had to be actively maintained against the natural tendency of the men who were fighting it to recognize each other as human beings. The 15th thing is what the war did to men's bodies over time, in ways that were not acute injuries but chronic deterioration. The conditions of trench life produced a specific constellation of health problems that accumulated in soldiers over the months and years of their service. Trench foot was caused by prolonged exposure to cold and wet conditions and resulted in the swelling, blistering, numbing, and in severe cases, the rotting of tissue in the feet and lower legs. It was preventable. It was prevented partially by orders requiring soldiers to regularly remove their boots and dry their feet and apply whale oil as a barrier against moisture. Compliance with these orders was imperfect because the conditions that caused trench foot were the conditions of the trench, and the conditions of the trench were not something that could be fully managed by individual soldiers following protocols. Trench foot was so common in the early years of the war that it was treated as an expected medical occurrence rather than a preventable injury, and medical personnel processed cases of it with the routine efficiency that the volume required. Respiratory illness was also endemic. The combination of wet, cold conditions, overcrowded living spaces, inadequate nutrition, and the physiological stress of chronic danger produced populations of soldiers whose immune function was compromised and whose respiratory tracts were repeatedly exposed to bacterial and viral pathogens with limited resistance available. Bronchitis, pneumonia, and tuberculosis were common. The influenza pandemic of 1918, which killed more people than the entire war had killed to that point, found populations of soldiers whose immune systems had been systematically weakened by years of the conditions just described, and it moved through them with a speed and lethality that reflected those weakened defenses. The pandemic killed soldiers and civilians in roughly comparable proportions. which is to say that the soldiers' years of military service had left them no more resilient than the civilians who had not served, and in some respects considerably less so. The 16th thing is the nature of the waiting. The Western Front is often described in terms of its moments of intense action. The bombardments, the assaults, the raids, the hand-to-hand combat of trench-clearing operations. These moments were real, and they were terrible. They were also measured in hours rather than in emotional intensity, a minority of the time that soldiers spent at the front. The majority of the time was spent waiting for the next bombardment to begin, waiting for orders, waiting during the slow hours of dawn and dusk, the stand-to periods when all soldiers were required to be at their firing positions in anticipation of an attack that usually did not come. Waiting during the long hours of darkness when patrols were sent into no man's land, and the men who remained in the trench listened for sounds that would indicate what was happening to the men who had left. Waiting during quiet periods for the quiet to end. The psychological experience of this waiting was not restful. The nervous system that had been conditioned by sustained exposure to sudden, extreme, lethal danger does not relax in its absence. It remains vigilant. It interprets ambiguous stimuli as potential threats. It produces a state of chronic low-grade alertness that is exhausting in ways that are different from the exhaustion of physical labor, harder to recover from, and ultimately more damaging to long-term psychological function. Veterans of the war described a specific quality of the waiting that distinguished it from all other waiting they had experienced. A quality produced by the fact that the danger was not hypothetical or remote, but was demonstrably, statistically, continuously present. The shell that killed your neighbor 3 days ago was not a random event in an otherwise safe environment. It was a sample from a distribution that included you. The waiting was always, underneath whatever surface activity filled it, a waiting for your own death or wounding, for the moment that the probability that had already taken so many men around you finally resolved in your direction. The 17th thing is the specific institutional mechanism by which soldiers were prevented from reporting accurately on what the war was actually like. Military censorship during World War I was extensive, systematic, and operated at multiple levels simultaneously. Soldiers' letters home were read by officers and potentially edited or withheld entirely if they contained content deemed prejudicial to morale or operationally sensitive. Journalists attached to the armies were required to submit their reports through military censorship before transmission, and the reports that were transmitted were frequently so far from the reality of the front that soldiers who had been there and then read newspaper accounts of battles they had participated in described a complete failure of recognition. The battle described in the newspaper and the battle they had been in were not the same event. The gap between the official account of the war and the experiential reality of the war created a specific kind of alienation in soldiers who returned home on leave and encountered the civilian world's understanding of what they were doing. The civilians were not stupid or malicious. They were working with the information available to them, and the information available to them had been filtered through a censorship apparatus designed to maintain support for the war and to prevent the demoralization that accurate information about the front's conditions might have produced. Soldiers on leave reported that they found it almost impossible to talk about their experiences because the vocabulary and the conceptual framework available to their families and friends at home had no capacity to receive what they were attempting to describe, not because the civilians were unwilling, but because the gap between the two realities had become too wide for the available language to bridge. Many soldiers stopped trying. They performed a version of normalcy during their leave periods, ate the meals that were prepared for them, slept in their beds, attended the social events that were organized, and then went back to the real world. Back to the only place where what they had become and what they knew made sense to the people around them. The 18th thing is what happened in the dugouts when the bombardments were at their heaviest. Dugouts varied enormously in construction quality and depth depending on the sector, the resources available, the length of time the position had been occupied, and the particular priorities of whoever was responsible for the engineering. Some dugouts were substantial structures, reinforced with timber and corrugated iron, deep enough to provide meaningful protection from all but a direct hit by the largest shells. Others were shallow scrapes in the earth that provided minimal protection from small arms fire and almost none from artillery. The quality of the dugout you occupied was not a trivial consideration. A soldier in a well-constructed deep dugout during a heavy bombardment had genuinely better odds of surviving it than a soldier in a shallow dugout during the same bombardment. The distribution of these dugouts was not random. Better positions were occupied by units that had been there longer, by officers rather than enlisted men, by units whose commanders had prioritized engineering work over other activities. The ordinary soldier lived with whatever was available. During the heaviest bombardments, men in whatever dugout they occupied experienced a physiological ordeal that was distinct from the experience of the battlefield in the open. The concussion from nearby explosions was transmitted through the ground and through the structure of the dugout and into the bodies of the men inside. Sustained over hours, this produced a specific kind of disorientation. Men described the ground shaking continuously, the walls of the dugout vibrating, loose earth falling from above, candles or lamps being extinguished by the pressure waves of close detonations. They described the noise as becoming something beyond loudness, a physical force. They described the experience of waiting in a confined underground space while the surface above them was being systematically destroyed by forces of enormous magnitude, and they described what that experience did to their minds. Many described a specific mental state that had no prior equivalent in their experience. Not panic, not numbness, something more like an absolute narrowing of the world to the next few seconds, everything outside the next few seconds becoming abstract. Everything inside the dugout becoming intensely, almost uncomfortably real. The men who experienced this and survived it, and were required to go through it again and again, developed coping mechanisms that were various and that appear in their accounts in consistent patterns. Some men prayed, some men became entirely silent, some men talked continuously about trivial subjects, the weather back home, what they planned to eat when the war was over, the names of girls they had known. Some men experienced uncontrollable physical responses, trembling, vomiting, incontinence, that they described afterward with the particular shame of having been unable to control their bodies in the presence of other men. This shame was not just about the physical response. It was about having been reduced, however temporarily, to something less than the controlled, functioning soldier that the system required and that masculine self-conception demanded. The men who experienced these things were not exceptions. They were the majority of men who went through sustained, heavy bombardment. The exceptions were the ones who felt nothing, and many who reported feeling nothing had simply reached a stage of dissociation in which their emotional responses had effectively shut down, which is a different thing from calm. The 19th thing is the prisoner experience, and specifically the experience of men taken prisoner at the moment of capture, which was in many cases the most dangerous moment of the entire prisoner experience. The laws of war as codified in the Hague Conventions provided formal protections for prisoners of war, protections that were observed by the major combatants in broadly systematic ways when it came to prisoners already in custody and being processed through the formal prisoner of war system. The moment of capture itself was a different environment. Men surrendering under fire in the chaos of a trench-clearing operation or an assault were at the mercy of whoever was immediately present, and the conventions of formal treatment had not yet intervened. Soldiers on both sides committed killings of surrendering men in these moments, not systematically and not as official policy, but as individual acts that the conditions and the emotional state of the perpetrators and the absence of immediate oversight combined to produce. The men who were taken prisoner and survived the moment of capture were then subject to conditions that varied enormously by time and by side. German prisoner of war camps in the early part of the war, when Germany was feeding its own civilian population adequately, maintained conditions that were tolerable, if not comfortable. By the later years of the war, when the Allied naval blockade had reduced German food supplies to the point where the civilian population was suffering significant malnutrition, prisoner rations declined accordingly, and the men in German camps were subject to the same shortage that was affecting the German home front generally. British camps for German prisoners were, by most accounts, better provisioned throughout the war, reflecting Britain's greater access to food imports and its less compromised supply situation. The men who spent the last years of the war as prisoners generally survived. They were not fighting, which was the most immediately lethal thing to be doing, and they were receiving food, however inadequate, which was better than the men who were not receiving it in certain frontline situations. This is a measure of the war's general level of conditions that prisoner of war status, with all its privations, could in some circumstances represent an improvement over the front line. The 20th thing is the nature of night in the trenches. The tactical logic of the Western Front created a specific relationship with darkness. Daylight in most sectors meant observation, and observation meant snipers. The German army, which had generally superior positions on higher ground for much of the war, also had superior optics in the early years, and German snipers with telescopic sights took a consistent toll on any movement in British trenches that was visible over the parapet. Soldiers learned not to show their heads above the parapet in daylight. They learned to move in bent-over or crawling positions through the trench system when they had to move. They learned to observe the other side through periscopes rather than by direct observation, because the profile of a head, briefly visible above a sandbag, was enough for a skilled sniper. And the skilled snipers were very good indeed. The headshot wounds treated by forward medical stations were consistent enough in their pattern that they did not require investigation. Everyone knew what had produced them. Darkness reversed some of this. Night meant that observation was limited, and that movement in no man's land was possible. It also meant the distinctive and deeply feared experience of the night patrol. Patrols were sent into no man's land for various purposes: reconnaissance, the cutting of enemy wire, the placing of listening posts, the raid on enemy trenches that was intended to take prisoners or destroy positions. They were conducted in complete darkness by small groups of men who navigated by memory of the terrain and by touch, who communicated by signals agreed in advance rather than by voice, and who knew that the enemy was also sending patrols into the same ground at the same time. The encounter between opposing patrols in no man's land in complete darkness, far from any support, was one of the most intimate and terrifying forms of combat in a war that had otherwise industrialized killing to a scale of impersonality. These encounters were close enough to involve hand weapons and were often over in seconds. Men who survived them and returned to their trenches were required to report what they had encountered, and then to sleep, and then, frequently, to go out again the following night. The 21st thing is what the war produced in terms of the men's relationship to their own possible death. The psychology of living under conditions of continuous lethal danger that cannot be meaningfully reduced by individual action is not well understood in peacetime, because peacetime does not produce it. The World War I soldier in a frontline trench was in a situation where death was, by statistical measure, a realistic expectation within any given period of significant length. Men who lasted a year were unusual. Men who lasted the full war were remarkable, and many of them had been wounded at least once. The fatalistic relationship with death that frontline soldiers developed was not the absence of the desire to live. It was a psychological adaptation to a situation in which the desire to live could not be translated into actions that reliably increased the chance of survival. You could be careful. You could learn the sector. You could duck at the right moment. You could develop the instincts that came from sustained exposure to a dangerous environment. All of this was real, and all of it mattered at the margin. But a shell fired into your trench did not know you were careful. A sniper watching your trench did not know you were experienced. The random and the systematic met in the trench in a proportion that made individual caution meaningful but not determinative. The soldiers who survived longest were often those who had achieved a specific mental posture toward their own death, a posture that involved neither denial, which was psychologically unsustainable over extended periods, nor acceptance, which implied passivity, but something more like coexistence. They carried the possibility of their death with them as a constant companion. They had thought about it with enough specificity that it was no longer hypothetical. Many of them had written the letters that were to be sent home in the event of their deaths, letters that sat in their packs or in the care of a friend, waiting. Having written those letters, having done that work, they were able to hold the fact of their possible death in a specific compartment of their consciousness, and to function in the other compartments with something that looked, from the outside, like normalcy. This was not normalcy. It was functional dissociation. It was the mind protecting itself by partitioning the unbearable, and it worked well enough that the men who achieved it could eat and sleep and tell jokes and perform the routines of trench life for years at a time, while carrying, in the background of everything they did, the continuous presence of their own death as a probable near-future event. The 22nd thing is what happened at the end. For the men who survived the war, the end came in November 1918 with the Armistice, a word that means an agreement to stop fighting rather than a peace, a technical distinction that turned out to matter. The men in the trenches were told that the war would end at 11 in the morning on the 11th day of the 11th month. In the hours before 11 o'clock, both sides continued fighting. In some sectors, this was at the habitual, low-level pace of ordinary trench activity. In other sectors, operations were underway that commanders had initiated knowing that the armistice was hours away, operations in which men died for objectives that would be irrelevant before the sun set on the day they were taken. The last recorded British soldier to die in combat, in World War I, Private George Ellison of the 5th Royal Irish Lancers, was killed at approximately 9:55 in the morning on November 11, 1918, approximately 65 minutes before the war officially ended. He is buried in a cemetery in Belgium, and his grave is, by chance, within sight of the grave of John Parr, who has been identified as the first British soldier to die in the war in August 1914. They never met. They are now approximately 100 yards apart. The men who were alive at 11 o'clock described the silence. The guns stopped. The sound that had been the constant background of their existence for years, that had been audible even in what passed for quiet, that had shaped their sleep and their waking and their movement and their thought, stopped. And in the sudden absence of that sound, men who had been fighting for years stood in trenches and in open fields and in the ruins of towns and did not know what to do. Some wept, some laughed, some did neither. Some reported that the silence felt wrong, that after years of the guns, the absence of sound was itself alarming to a nervous system that had been calibrated to it, that had learned to read its patterns and gradations, that had organized its alertness around it. The silence felt like a new kind of danger. It took time to believe the silence was real. The men were then demobilized, a process that took months and that returned them, with varying degrees of ceremony and support, to a civilian world that had been waiting for them, and that did not know what to do with them any more than they knew what to do with it. The infrastructure for addressing the psychological consequences of what they had experienced did not exist. The vocabulary did not exist. The diagnostic frameworks did not exist. There were pensions for physical disabilities, and there were hospitals for men whose conditions were too severe to ignore, and there were, for the majority of men who came home, walking and talking and outwardly functional, the expectation that they would return to work and build families and get on with it, which many of them did, in the way that the men in the trenches had gotten on with it, which is to say, by continuing to function while carrying in the background of everything a weight that no one around them could see or fully understand. The British Army that fought World War I processed approximately 5 million men through its ranks over the 4 years of the conflict. The French Army processed approximately 8 million. The German Army approximately 13 million. The Russian Army approximately 12 million. The Ottoman Empire approximately 3 million. The Austro-Hungarian Empire approximately 7 million. The total number of human beings who passed through the military apparatuses of the combatant nations in World War I is estimated at over 65 million. Of these, approximately 17 million were killed. Approximately 23 million were wounded. The wounded figure does not capture the men who were psychologically damaged in ways that left no visible mark and were never formally counted. It does not capture the men who died in the years following the war from wounds and illnesses they had sustained during it. Men who did not appear in the military casualty figures, but whose lives had been determined by the war nonetheless. The war ended. The armies demobilized. The trenches slowly collapsed and filled in, and the grass grew over them, and the shell craters silted up, and the farmers eventually returned to the land and cultivated it. And the bones that the plows turned up were collected and moved to cemeteries, and the cemeteries were maintained, and the memorials were built, and the ceremonies were established, and the last veteran of the Western Front died in 2009, a man named Harry Patch, who had refused to speak about his experiences for most of his life, and who said, near the end of it, that war was organized murder and nothing else. He was 111 years old. He had been 19 when he was wounded at Passchendaele and taken out of the line, and had spent the remaining 92 years of his life in possession of knowledge that no ceremony had fully honored and no silence had fully contained. The war he had been part of did not end when the guns stopped. It had simply been absorbed by the men who survived it and the societies that produced them into the ongoing texture of a world that had learned, through 4 years of industrial application, that human beings could be processed in very large numbers with a very high degree of organizational efficiency, and that the machinery for doing so, once built, did not simply disappear when the immediate reason for building it had passed.